Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to start to try to explain more about my life stories and that I think greatly contributed to my awakening to this state of consciousness and basically my allowance of Christ to enter me. I realized that more and more as time went on and my observation of other spiritual teachers and their followers as well, that my story is unique. Even though I really hesitated to, open this Pandora's box, really. As you can tell, in my previous videos, I didn't really go into details about my upbringing, for example. But it seems kind of necessary to start to get into it because I think this really contributed to my awakening journey that other teachers simply have not experienced, not even close to what I experienced, and that's why they can't awaken further. That's really my conclusion of why they refuse to awaken further, as well that they can't resonate with the text in Course in Miracles. Because I believe that some of them did look at that text, but it probably just doesn't resonate. But it did for me. And why is that? Well, the main reason is because of my life experiences in this world, in this particular lifetime. So I refrain from talking about it because, I carry this name, first of all, Jesus Christ. That's very significant if you're someone who's, interested in that, or, you have some ideas about Jesus, right? It's not like something you would carry lightly. So I realize that what I say to the world and to you carries that kind of significance by claiming who I claim to be, basically. But at the same time, if I don't try to explain how I came here due to my personal life, then that's also a large part of my journey is missing, right? That perhaps most people cannot just like piece it together without me explaining more and going into more detail. So do you see that kind of conflict where there's the burden of carrying Christ's name, and on the other hand, having to share more about my life story that may be very controversial or unpleasant at the same time. So that's kind of what held me back a lot, first of all, and also just I didn't really start to have any audience whatsoever like that I feel like could remotely understand, because you do have to be at a certain level of emotional development or spiritual development to understand, as well as to even want to care, because most people like they don't care, and even most therapists I talk to, like, they can't understand it. So that's the other challenge. But I think now is, probably the right time for me to start to share more, especially in relation to how I awakened here. So, as I was saying before, I had two very spiritually incompatible parents that I grew up with. And a large part of my life was really just questioning why I even went into that family in the first place. Like, why did I, because I was a spirit, right? Before I incarnated into that situation, why did I choose that family? Like, a lot of my like spiritual questions was around this because it was just so deeply incompatible. It's almost like me having to acknowledge Vladimir Putin as my dad, for example. If you heard me talk about Putin, like, we're very spiritually incompatible. Now, I'm not saying my parents are identical to him, but I'm saying that's the degree of incompatibility I'm talking about, and I'm not even exaggerating. So you can see how it's very baffling for me to try to grasp, like, why did I even choose this family? Because most people, they kind of get along with their family, I would say. Perhaps not, but I don't generally hear about people having such a large, incompatibility with their family. So a lot of my spiritual pursuits was partly to answer this question. So, I still don't have a straight answer. I have some answers, which I will explain later, but I just want to start with that. Because that did contribute to, me awakening further than all the other teachers. So most of my life, growing up with my immediate family, which is just my parents, I didn't have siblings or anything, and that was part of the problem, is I don't have like other supports. It was just me trapped in that situation. Uh, both my parents had massive egos, basically, and their minds were very distorted. And my household was just like my parents were constantly fighting. They would fight for a few days, and then they would stop for a few days, maybe a week, at best 2 weeks at a time. They stop, and then they would fight again for another week, and this just kept going on, and it never stopped. I'm not kidding you. That's the family I lived in. Is constant fighting and often very violent, shouting and throwing things, sometimes even like getting physical with each other. This is the kind of household I lived in. And but they would always pretend like the fighting could stop. They would always pretend like they could stop and not fight anymore. But it would just keep happening again anyways. Like there's never like lasting peace, you could say. So this started when I was very young, like as far as I have memory, basically, like maybe like 3 or 4. I would say maybe it was less frequent when I was younger, but it was very frequent, even since I was let's say in elementary school. Um, so that's the kind of situation I was in. But as a child, I was helpless in that situation. I had to depend on my parents for survival. So I didn't question it back then. I couldn't, right? When you're a little child, you solely, like in my situation, I solely depended on my parents. So I had to dissociate the pain in part to survive in that family because I had to. I had no choice. There was no other choice. Definitely because where I came from, it was originally from China. Uh, I did grow up there, and there was no such thing that I know of is where it's like child services or the police caring about such things. So, the neighbors didn't care, even though I'm pretty sure they know about it. So I had to endure it. And I also, as a child, I didn't know better. Like what's even normal. I just knew there was just constant fighting. And I remember that I would cry to bed frequently, like as a little kid. So instead of being read like bedtime stories, I cry myself to bed on a regular basis, like every week or two, basically, since I was a child. So I was already kind of depressed as a child, but children are better at sort of dissociating that, you could say. So for a long time I didn't, because you have to develop cognitively to a certain extent to really grasp the circumstance that you were in, right? Most children cannot just immediately understand what was going on or even consider that as abuse, right? Like I didn't think about it as abusive because that was my normal. And nobody asked how I felt or how I was doing, like with this constant fighting. Like neither of my parents cared about how I felt about that situation. Well into my 20s, like they never asked me how it was impacting me. In fact, every time I pleaded them to stop, because I would plead them to stop, especially the older I got, because it was affecting me more the older I got, actually, because I was more and more aware of how toxic and dysfunctional they were and how much they were affecting me, like mentally and spiritually, right? Because living with this kind of situation, it affects your mental well-being. But they didn't care. They just continued to fight, and it's like it really felt like I just was not a factor. I was not important in that equation. So as well, on top of it, I was told that I can't talk about it with other people. I was forbidden to speak about it, like I was mentioning before. Uh, I would be kind of, my mother especially, she would try to tell me that if I started to talk about it, then, they could be taken away from me, that, that could threaten my life, basically. It's almost like a scare thing. So, and also guilt tripping as well, that, oh, you don't want your dad to land in jail or something. Like um, this kind of argument was used on me frequently. So even though my mom is sort of a victim in that situation as well, she was still defending him, you see, to the detriment of like my well-being and interests, basically. Basically, in that, you could say in that culture, there's somewhat of a normalization where children are treated as like not very important, or um, in terms of in terms of priority in comparison to the parents. There's this hierarchy, right? A lot of cultures, I would say, especially places like China, there's this hierarchy where children are placed secondary to their parents. So there's already that kind of system in place where it came from. And I would say that exacerbated or normalized the abuse that I was going through. And so basically, my parents, they try to, they would physically separate at times, like this happened a few times, but they could never get like a true separation. It would just be temporary separation for like, at most a few weeks, and then they would get back together again. And this constant like being dragged around this like emotional roller coaster that, they're like, it's either like they're about to get divorced, right? They would still talk about divorce, but they never got divorced. It's like they would talk about it and they would fight with each other as though that's what was going to happen. But then a few days later, they're back together again, as though nothing had happened. And so the older I got, the crazier this seemed to me, right? As you can imagine, like that's not how most families are. Like if you just don't get along, you should separate. But because of that culture in part, where they kind of frown upon divorce and separation, that was embedded in the Chinese culture, especially that generation. This is kind of like justified this like relationship of theirs. So basically, I suffered both health problems and emotionally living in that environment. And on top of that, my mother was also very abusive towards me, whether or not she's conscious of it. I don't think she's that conscious of it, but regardless, that's what happened. And the abuse is very like, it's not like necessarily physical, it's like psychological manipulation, where I'm not allowed to individuate and separate from her, basically. It's like I had to be this, almost like an enmeshed twin with her. This was something that she decided was normal. That if she gave birth to me, then it was justifiable that I should basically have the same kind of thoughts as her, same kind of behavior as her, same kind of beliefs as her. Like basically everything has to like sync up with her mind. But you see, because I was so spiritually incompatible with them, like I said, this couldn't happen. I mean, maybe it could have happened if I was spiritually similar to her, right? That could have happened. But in my case, I was spiritually opposite of her in so many ways. And I'm not saying that to be like, I'm better and stuff, but to try to tell you that the spiritual incompatibility, you could say, exacerbated this situation for me. And so she couldn't, and this is also like about the ego mind. So that's kind of why I'm telling it like this. It's basically like her ego wouldn't allow me to form my own independence. So she sees me trying to form my own independence as I got older as a threat to her and a humiliation to her. This is really how she felt about it, because she would time and time again try to get me back to her mind, get me back to her fold, basically. And this is actually very similar to what Vladimir Putin is doing with Ukraine, even though it's maybe not, the exact same kind of story. But there's some parallel here. It has to do with the ego mind. It's this feeling that she felt entitled to basically both my time and energy and just my devotion to her, basically. She felt very entitled to that just because of the sheer fact that she gave birth to me and fed me, I guess, right? So this was kind of her logic. Like she would repeat this kind of thing to me, that I gave birth to you. Like I made certain sacrifices so that you can like, have food and shelter and stuff, like this kind of thing. Like she would constantly guilt me. And as a result, if you start to disagree with me, you're being an ungrateful child. There's literally the kind of psychological narrative she used on me over and over. And it definitely worked on me for a long time, because as a child, like I didn't form that kind of independent thought, right? Until much later. Like it took time and like to start to question that. So for a long time I was enmeshed with her. But I realized more and more that it was abusive because like I started to, develop more awareness and wanting to have certain interests and just people I want to be friends with, but she would start to control all of that. She would start to control who I should be friends with, who I should talk to, right? What kind of career I should have, what kind of jobs I should have, like all this kind of stuff, like basically everything. And of course, the older you get, you realize this is not going to work. This is highly abusive. Like you can't. I'm not here to. It makes you, turns you into like a robot, basically. If you can't choose like your job, career, your friends, who you date, for example, like that turns you into a robot, doesn't it? So that's why the older I got, the more and more I got into conflict with her, basically. And as a result of that, the separation had to happen, right? It's inevitable because, and so as I was saying, it's similar to what Putin and Zelensky's going through right now, in some ways, because it's like Putin feels entitled to Ukraine, basically. Putin and his team. Um, but they're obviously ideologically not even close in alignment. So just because they had that history, right? It's like this history of being my parents, they feel entitled to basically my devotion to them. And the similar thing I would say with Russia and Ukraine right now, if you can see that parallel. So, you know, even though I wasn't like, I wasn't really like physically hit much in my household. This only happened like a few times when I was younger, but it was mostly like psychological threat. But it was like, that was enough for me to, have a very hard time break away from my parents. Because my dad was also, had sort of like violent tendencies. So I never felt safe around either of my parents. So there's always this threat of like, if I disagree with them too much or called them out too much in the open, then something really terrible could happen to me. And I know it sounds like I'm just perhaps exaggerating, but this is really how I felt. It really felt like one of those families where you can't break away from. Like I was trapped. Even when I started to move away, like I moved away after university because I knew I couldn't live in that situation. Like I had to get out. But even when I moved away physically, they would still psychologically try to enmesh me into their toxic, you could say, lifestyle, if you can call it that. So, just physically moving away was not enough to truly like break away from them. There was additional like steps, you could say, involved to be psychologically distant from them as well. And they didn't want to let me go. They couldn't accept that. It's like their ego felt very, you could say, bruised by that, because they really want to feel like I should just be okay with whatever they did and whatever happened to me. But you see, I don't have much control about how I felt about that. I was stuck in that situation chronically, right? With no help. So I had to grieve and heal like away from them, and it's like I had no choice but to break away from them. It's like, yeah, maybe some people say I could have had a choice, but for me it was like there was no choice. I had to get away. My health was suffering. Like my parents were making me sick very often, and I had developed all kinds of health problems that caused additional suffering on top of the depression and emotional suffering. I developed physical health problems because it's related, right? Your mind and body, it's related, especially if you're a highly sensitive person, and I was. So, and at the same time, I had to manage basic survival. I had to find a way to pay for a roof over my head, like after I moved out. I didn't have much money or anything, and I didn't have, like I said, other supports. I was just on my own, quite literally. And so you can imagine, I left home and had almost no money on me and having to figure out basic survival on top of developing these health and emotional problems. And it's really like I really went through a lot of difficult times just to start to get away from it, basically. And so I can't tell everything in this video because there's more to my life, obviously, because I didn't start to awaken seriously until a few years after that. But I would say that this early years, or you could say the majority of my life actually, that played a significant role in me awakening to this state. Because I truly experienced like deep suffering and depression that I don't think the other teachers have experienced, from what I can gather. So that's why it's important for me to at least start to talk about it, even if almost nobody can understand it, right? Because it's not the kind of situation that I wish on anybody. But it just seems that it was somewhat of a unique situation or life circumstance that contributed to my awakening to Christ consciousness. And so, how does this tie to Christ's arrival in me, though? I would say some of my very early awakenings, it already started to feel like there was a higher power, like, trying to help me. Like, this was my first few mushroom awakenings. It felt as though something from above, basically, tried to give me another life, um, and that it was watching over me, and that it was very upset on my behalf for what I went through. And later on, the more I awakened, the more I realized this was from Jesus himself, like this being that I ultimately became. Um, so a lot of my awakenings is tied to, you could say, this being alerted to my life and my suffering, because I was suffering constantly, chronically, right? And the suffering permeated into the mind of Jesus Christ. That, at least that's what it seems like from my awakening journey. So, it's kind of similar to Zelensky, because I was saying that he had called for help recently to like a higher power, which is me right now, and and that's how our minds merged, right? He called for help. He may have used some other methods, right? I couldn't ask him right now, but that was the feeling, is that he called for help and I received it, and that's what allowed our minds to start to merge. So I'm saying that there was a similar thing happening with me in my personal circumstance, that it felt as though it's because of my call for help, you could say, because I couldn't get away. I couldn't get away from these people, like my parents. It's not so easy, because society forbids you from doing that. Um, it forbids you from talking about it, and almost nobody could understand the specific situation I was in, because you really couldn't understand it unless you experience it yourself, really, like, at since a young age, kind of thing. So I was having trouble finding even like a therapist that could understand me, like I said. Like, there was no therapist that could truly help me. So I'm saying this is why Jesus Christ returned in me, is a large part because of my call for help and my chronic suffering in that situation. So I hope that makes some sense. Um, Again, it's not like the first incarnation at all, right? And that makes it harder for me to talk about, because people already have certain ideas about Christ and how he probably should be returning in this world, for example. Like, people have some ideas based on the first incarnation. So I realized that, right? I realized that it's very different from the first incarnation, and that makes it harder for me to try to share this kind of story with you. But I realized that I have to start to share it, because this is what happened. This is the truth, right? This is the truth of how it went down for me. It's, as cliche as it sounds, it really was like Jesus Christ saved me from my own family, if you can believe it. There was a very specific, you could say, event as well that happened when I visited my parents, I guess, a couple years ago now, where they were still trying to, you could say, reel me into their minds. But like I mentioned before, their minds were highly incompatible with me, and they couldn't see that, right? Their minds are so distorted, they couldn't even see the incompatibility there. And so they were still trying to, you could say, control me or get me back to where they were or where things were before. It's understandable, but I can't, like, it's like, again, spiritually impossible. And because of that constant, like, it turned into harassment, right? Because they wouldn't give up. That's really the overall kind of approach they had, was they just wouldn't give up letting me go. Like, their ego doesn't want to let me go and be like, have this basically distance and boundaries that I try to set. I try to set boundaries with them because of what happened to me. And this was also the advice of many therapists, right? So, but they were not willing to just let me do that. And so that was one time where Christ consciousness had to deliberately arrive in me to cut the cords. So, I won't go into detail about how that went down, but basically, something happened when I visited them like 2 years ago, and that Jesus Christ helped me with, that allowed me to cut the cords. Not fully, but a lot more than what I was able to do on my own, basically. So you can see how this is not like easy to share, and I don't expect you to immediately understand what I'm talking about or even agree with it, because I know it can be triggering. because that's maybe not how your parents are and how you feel about your family. But this is my story, and I feel like a very important aspect of why I awakened to the state. It really is like no one could help me, right? Nobody in this world could help me except Jesus Christ. And that's why I awakened to the state. I allowed him to transfer his being to me over time in the last, like, I guess it's like 2 years ago now, basically. If you look at my first video, I think it's almost 2 years ago. So that's around the time where Christ started to fully return me, basically. And there's some more things I can share about my life too, but I'll stop here for today because it's going to make this video too long. I just wanted to start to explain more about my life because I think, fortunately or unfortunately, it is kind of unique, and I think a reason why the other teachers are not interested in awakening to the state.